Hi there, this is C. Anderson, and I am so excited about this Facebook Live, and we're streaming to YouTube as well today. I work as a DMM or Disciple Making Movement coach and trainer. I work with Youth with a Mission, Frontier Missions, and I also have a blog called that's found at DMMsFrontierMissions.com. So I'm here live with Roy Moran, author of Spent Matches. And Roy, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. This is quite a privilege. I live in North Kansas City, uh, home of the world champion Kansas City Chiefs. Had to put that in.
There you go. We just talked about that.
So I am involved in a local fellowship here called Shoal Creek. Started it 20 plus years ago. And over the years, kind of got involved in trying to figure out what does multiplicative growth look like? What does scaling the gospel look like? And it led me to people like David Watson and people like the City Team folks, City Team International, Jerry Trouzo, Miraculous Movements folks, and into that crowd and being mentored by them. But I'm married, have four grown married children and 10 grandchildren.
Wow, that's awesome.
Love to play golf. So that's my whole biography right there.
There you go. Yeah, well, I should mention too, I'm also married and we have three grown children as well and one grandson. So I'm a little behind you on the grandkids category, but that multiplicative growth is happening in our families as well as our ministries. It's awesome. Yeah. Well,
Absolutely.
our topic today is about can disciple making movements happen in North America? And Roy, that's a question that I get all the time. I do a lot of webinars about disciple making movements and training, and especially when I'm training people from the West, they ask that question. So we're going to be talking about lots of things related to that and different questions. And if you are on our live stream, do feel free to ask questions. Go ahead and post those there, and we'll be taking time towards the end of our time together. We'll be here about 45 minutes or an hour, and we'll be taking time to answer those questions. Maybe we'll answer a few in the middle as well. So feel free to post those questions. We'd love to see those from you and address those as well. I know I have lots of questions about it too. And Roy, in many ways, you've been so much one of the pioneers in disciple making movements here in North America. So appreciate your work and so inspired by your book. But tell me a little bit, what has your journey been with disciple making movements? How did you first hear about them or get engaged with this and begin to move towards that?
Well, there's a lot of streams that are going on in my life that kind of lead here. It's like the perfect storm in some ways. But you know, we have I have my wife and I have always had a desire to see lost people connect with their Father in heaven, and so that piece has always been there. And so when we planted a church, which was right out of the Willow Creek movement, the seeker movement, and feeling like that was the best methodology that we had available to ourselves. So we went after that and we were successful at it and we saw some rapid growth. And in the middle of that, we not only saw rapid growth, but we got a facility that we weren't expecting, um, and that created more growth. And so at that point, we realized that we were bound by our campus. We were bound by some of our leadership structures, that the methodologies we had, pardon me, were difficult to see expansion. We began to look. We just ask ourselves, who's doing something that's multiplying beyond the hard resources, the fixed resources that most legacy churches have. And so we went everywhere. We went to the multi-site folks and conferences and started, traveling and asking everyone, from West Coast to East Coast, the big churches, the innovative places, all kinds of stuff. And in the middle of that, I was also involved in some folks and with some folks in South Africa. And I happened upon David Watson and Paul Watson put up a a little website called cpmtr.org. And
Okay.
what it was a camera set in the middle of a room when David was doing some training for the city team folks out in San Jose. And they were terrible videos in some ways, compared to today. It's just a video setting in a room. But I listened to those things, cut them up, made MP3 files out of them, listened to them over and over, and I heard some things in there that really intrigued me. I'd always believed in the priesthood of the believer. I always believed that there was this sense in which everyone should get a chance to play in this game. That Jesus, when he gave the Great Commission to the disciples, it wasn't to a leadership team, it was to everyone. And so I've always felt that our methodologies, our way of working ought to include everyone. And I heard that in there. I've always felt like reading the Bible for yourself was important. And I know everyone believes that, but I mean, teaching people to get their fingerprints on the Bible was valuable. And I heard this idea of discovery and getting non-believers reading the Bible and discovering who Jesus was for themselves. And that intrigued me as well. And then this idea of watching this multiplicative nature of things grow kind of rapidly in many areas and stuff like that. So as I ran across that, it just amazes me. I happened to be going to South Africa to hold a training conference, and I just changed directions really quickly. I saw David Brudrick had a guest post on David Watson's blog, and David Brudrick was in South Africa, so I called him, or I emailed him, I guess, and I said, hey, is there any chance if I flew you down and flew you back and took care of everything, could you come down and do this training conference? And so I booted the guy I had already was taken over there to do the conference, unfortunately, and put Brudrick in there. And that was really my first exposure live. I'd seen all this stuff from David Watson on video, but I got to know David there, and David introduced me to the city team folks, and they began to just help me see. And so looking at the stuff happening across all sub-Saharan Africa, but mainly in East Africa, as I got to know people like Isla Tassi, and began to sit with them and let them kind of unpack the Bible for me in a different way that I'd seen before. And it just began a revolution in my own mind and my own heart.
Wow. Wow. What I hear you saying, Roy, is you were hungry for something more.
Mm-hmm.
You had experienced success, you'd seen growth, but you looked at the lost around you and said, there's got to be something more. And then you were also driven by the understanding of the priesthood of all believers, that everyone needs to play the game. I love that, and I agree with that so much as well. And just have really taught that a lot myself. When I teach on disciple making movements, the priesthood of all believers is just one of the most foundational understandings if we want to see multiplication. And what I love about that is it's not a cultural principle that works in one country and not another. It's a biblical principle that we all need to embrace, shifting from an Old Testament mentality of, it's only a certain caste. I've worked in South Asia and India. It's only a certain caste that can do things, or it's only someone who has specialized training who can be used by God, to understanding that he's called all of us. He's equipped all of us to be ministers of the gospel.
Yeah,
and so I love that you mentioned that.
one of the things that those guys would say to me, I remember guys like a Jim Yost who works in Southeast Asia. He says the same God here is the same God there.
Mm-hmm.
God doesn't love Southeast Asians or Sub-Saharan Africans any more than he loves people in North America. It's the same God. And in fact, a friend of mine from West Africa, Shadonka Johnson's writing a book with that title right now.
Okay.
Just
Wow.
this idea that God is the same everywhere, and if that's true, then we can set the gospel free everywhere.
That's right. That's right. I think it's one of the things that the enemy so wants to use against us. We we believe so easily that lie that it can happen for someone else, it can happen in another location that is different, or my place is too hard for this to happen here, or it couldn't happen through me.
Oh yeah.
And so, yeah, we hear that a lot. And even when we first started introducing Yin Kai to people in India, or where he had seen so much happen in other parts of Asia, they would say, "Oh, well, that works there. It wouldn't work in India," And we've seen such huge movements. And as you mentioned, even the Bhojpuri movement with David Watson, that kind of started a lot of things off. It can happen anywhere, but we do have to believe that it can, right? That's so key. And
Well, it's hard work, I mean, it's not like a magic potion. And
that's
it's
right.
when you get to know the stories of some of these folks, you begin to see that it really does. I mean, it's hard work, first of all, tearing down the frameworks that we have operated on. I'm a real fan of a guy named David Dunning, who developed the Dunning-Kruger effect. And he talks about how our mental frameworks are so fixed. We get these patterns that we operate off of, and we don't know it, but we love these patterns because they make life easy and
Mm.
stuff. And he wrote an article um, uh, talking about how it creates idiocy in us because we have a pattern, and it helps us in one area, and new information cannot get in there. And
Wow.
as a result of that, we just keep going down this you know path. And so for me, it was really hard work to tear down. I have pretty steep theological education, and so disassembling and reassembling that framework was hard work for me.
Yeah, that's so true. And I just talked about that on a webinar, as well as I was saying, a lot of what we have to do things simply is we have to unlearn the
Mhm.
complicated methods
Oh
that
yeah.
we become so comfortable with, and
Yeah.
that have become our normal patterns. And so there is an unlearning process, especially in the churched world. When you're working with brand new believers in Afghanistan, or someplace where the gospel hasn't penetrated much, they just learn it and they see it in the Bible, and they don't have to unlearn. And in some ways, that's one of the reasons why things can move more rapidly in those contexts, because we do have a bit of an unlearning process that we have to do. But I want to ask you, I loved your book, Spent Matches. That's an awesome, I think it's one of the best rationales for why we need DMMs I've seen out there. I've told a lot of people that, Roy, and recommended your book. So our guys are going to be putting those links in there on the chats for how to get your book. I have it up on my website as one of the resources I recommend. But in that book, you talk about your dream that you had,
Yeah.
and you were hungering to see thousands and thousands of lost people. You were praying for that, and then you had this dream. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I used to wake up early on Sunday mornings and just lay in bed and pray and visualize that God would bring um, thousands of people to Shoal Creek that morning. Now we have a facility with 1,200 seats and 435 parking spots and all that kind of stuff, but we put a pin in the map and drew a circle, and following church growth experts tell us that people will drive 30 minutes to come to a Sunday morning uh, experience in a local fellowship. And so the 300,000 people live in that circle, so we're praying that God would make it hard for them to go to hell because of us. And
Mm.
we do this crazy thing on Sunday morning that doesn't look anything like church. It's more of an outreach type deal. And so uh, as I'm reading things, the spontaneous expansion of the church and its hindrances, I'm reading Dave Hunt's dissertation about what's happening in East Africa, all this kind of stuff. All this stuff's filtering in my mind. And so I had this dream. And of course, for those of you that understand the theological landscape out there, I graduated from Dallas Theological Seminary. And so dreams in Dallas Seminary aren't exactly, they're not, you know, I didn't have a class
A
on
lot,
dreams.
right?
Yeah, a little allergy there at times, although things have changed, radically but So I had this dream, and the dream is that that God answers that prayer, that all 300,000 people would come to Shoal Creek that Sunday morning. And then as the dream begins to unfold and people, and I envision, you'd have to know the geography of Shoal Creek's campus. We're near a Ford plant, just a stone's throw from a Ford plant where probably if you drive an F-150 truck, it was made there. And so I envision guys, and all the guys and gals that work there have these blue herringbone coveralls. And I envision people coming off of work, and an 8-hour shift driving. And we're not too far from this Shoto traffic way, which has some strip joints on it. And I envision people, coming out of there with hangovers and maybe still high on drugs or something, and people coming from just north of us or traditional suburbs where moms and dads and upper middle class people live, getting in their Volvo station wagons and driving in, and all these people just coming to this space, and the infrastructure where we're on I-35, which runs from north the border to the south border of the United States. We have several different highways and interstates near us and stuff, so it's easy for us, easy access. But when 300,000 people try to do that, it created this nightmare. Traffic jam, people couldn't get there, and then all of a sudden what used to be a dream, a beautiful dream, turns into a nightmare, in the sense is that people who have a heart to connect with God can't get there physically, because the strategy that I had chosen to put people in a single space at a certain time of the day didn't work. It just, they couldn't access that. Even when I'm praying and they had hearts, it didn't work. And so it really, it was like an earthquake in my soul to say, you got to do something differently. You have the gospel trapped, and you've got to set it free. And so those kinds of soul shattering moments were going on in my life, in 2005, 2006, 2007, as we're trying to figure out, how to be continue to let the gospel penetrate the area that God had given us.
Yeah, wow. I remember when I read that, and I was just imagining, I've been to that part of Kansas City, and I was imagining the traffic jams, and I thought, how true. We pray, God, give us revival, give us radical multiplication, but then our very strategies of which we're using to try to reach people actually prohibit the answer to our prayer. And not that God doesn't also use, God works in so many different ways, but what an inspiration to catalyze us. We have to change. We must change the way that we go about making disciples and do things differently. If we want to see the answers to our prayers, we have to be willing to make some changes. And yeah, and you made some big changes, and we're gonna talk about those, and you describe those in your book. But first, tell me, just our audience is out there too, and maybe you guys, if you're on, you can add some of the challenges you face. But what are some of the common challenges that you hear about or you faced yourself, Roy, in applying disciple making movement principles in a North American context?
Wow. We could have several editions of this discussion here, because one of the things early on that I didn't realize that I now realize, and I always tell people this at the beginning. Stan Parks, who was one of my early confidants and mentors in this, we both have a big influence from David Watson, and David has these 23 critical principles. And one of the principles is to expect the greatest results in the hardest places. Mm-hmm. So Stan looked at me one day and he said, we were talking about the difficulties in North America and all the obstacles and things. And he says, maybe you are working in one of the hardest places.
Wow. Encouragement.
You used to think about, you mentioned Afghanistan, or, if you're in the Kandahar province or something, and you're trying to plant the gospel and there's war around you, and you think of those places as really, really hard. Or you're in Northwest Africa, and in these regimes that just are brutal toward the movement of Christianity and stuff. But the fact is that the more churched a place is, the more difficult it becomes to plant a new way of gospeling. And I think well, that's what I faced, is that this is like pushing a boulder up a hill. There's never a moment where you feel momentum, because you're always helping people disassemble their thinking, just in terms. I was in a group of like-minded disciple-making people yesterday, and I was I was astounded by even their use of the word church. Uh,
Mm.
that talking about well, we're getting a church. It's like, well, you mean a building? And just that loose use of it. That our terminology is so freighted with bad theology in that sense, is that people go to church, all that kind of stuff, and the idea of a biblically functioning community, being the people of God is really hard. So I think that's difficult. The thinking that people have. We find even that people who come to faith, the Christian community quickly zaps them up. They quickly learn that there are Christian radio stations, there's Christian books, there's all these podcasts of people that do things, and so they get infected by a different type of Christianity. If we don't work hard, to keep them focused in on, look, this is about you, God, and the Bible, and reaching your network, and it's not about the accumulation of knowledge and experiences and those kinds of things. So our surroundings, really do fight against us in terms of keeping that DNA as pure as possible. And the comfort of the culture that I live in is significant. There's virtually nothing they can't buy or they can't get a hold of themselves. Hunger's not a problem, although there are pockets of small little places. Medical is not a problem. They don't need water. Their issues with water is they complain about too much chlorine in the water or whatever. It's not the access to good water. So finding poverty that we can access, finding ways to serve and engage our communities, becomes difficult. And you have to think about poverty in a different way.
Mm.
I think immediately when I think of poverty, I think of money. I think of rural situations, which both of us have been exposed to, and there's genuine poverty there. They live day to day and that kind of stuff. But we have a poverty here in our area of, like, marriage, for instance. People, they don't know how to do marriage, and so when a for sale sign goes up on a home, generally it represents the fracture, of a marriage and stuff. And so that poverty exists. And so we find, ways to utilize marriage as an access ministry, as a community engagement. And
Right.
that, we're now experimenting with purpose. We're finding that, successful, 35, 40-year-old, couple of kids, decent job, making the kind of money they've always wanted to make. They've got the house they've always wanted, and now there's like, is this all there is? And so there's this sense in which they don't get the purpose, and so we're experimenting with a curriculum that is an engagement piece. It's a gospel-centered life design course. That's
Mm.
the pathway, into a relationship with God and stuff. So
Wow.
you just have to be creative when you think about that, because those are the things that are difficult. But I do think, and I say this, and I would want to have coffee and help people understand, I'm not anti-church. I will be speaking in a local fellowship on Sunday. I will be gathering with a small group of people and stuff. So, but oftentimes, because of the mentality that exists, the attractional mentality that exists, it's difficult for churches to understand that the success of the kingdom is about the gospel moving away from them, not the gospel moving toward them.
Wow.
And
Wow. I want you to say that one more time. That's a quote worth tweeting out, right? Say it one more time.
well, helping people who work and love, local church ministry to understand that our success for kingdom advancement is not about the gospel moving toward them, but it's about the gospel moving away from them. And
Right.
so helping them understand that the beauty of that is what Jesus, when he shared the Great Commission with his disciples, that was his dream, is that
Mhm.
gospel has got to move away from us. And it's got to be reproductive, in that sense, as it moves, so it replicates, from person to person to person.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna pause you there for just a minute. I mean, what you're talking about now is something that we often refer to. I know Victor Chowdhury. I don't know if he's the one who coined the phrase, but he's who I first heard it from. One of the great movement leaders and teachers in India. He talks about the go church, not the come church, and that's basically the same kind of thing that you're talking about. Instead of come to our church, it's
Yeah,
how can we equip people to be goers, even if it's going across the street to their neighbor or sharing with the lady at Walmart,
yeah, yeah.
or stopping and pausing to notice that person who looks sad in the Panera breads or whatever it is, that you are, and being willing to step into their lives. So yeah, that's so key. And I was also going to mention, when we talk about it being more difficult in one place than another, I often tell people the most difficult place to start a DMM is where I'm trying to start one. I mean, we all have difficulties. It's not going to be easy. There's some really amazing biblical simple principles that can be incredibly effective, more than we could ever dream or hope for, as we apply what Jesus did and his apostles did, what the disciples did into everyday life as normal disciples. Incredible fruit can come beyond our expectations. But at the same time, there are challenges in every situation, whether you're working in Afghanistan, or maybe your biggest challenge might be persecution.
Mhm.
Um, there are challenges in any context, and there's a price to be paid.
Yeah.
In prayer, a price and willingness to do things differently, sometimes be misunderstood for the ways that you're doing things, which maybe are outside of that normal path that we talked about earlier. But yeah, I've got a question from somebody. Just wanted to mention, they were saying they came on late and they wanted to know if this was going to be available on YouTube or Facebook. It is available on both of those, so you can go back later and watch the entire thing, and share it with others. We do encourage you to share this Facebook Live with those who are going to benefit from it, who maybe couldn't be here today, and let others know some rich gems that Roy's giving us here today. But there are very real challenges in applying these anywhere in the world, and some of the challenges you mentioned here in the US, because there is such a traditional kind of church mentality, attractional church mentality and model that has been used, and that people are familiar with. And one of the amazing things about COVID-19 has been how it has really shaken the whole church building, the church is a building concept, hasn't it? I mean, we've had to do church differently. And I think that's been a really good thing, for many of us to have to realize the church still goes on. The church is us.
Yeah.
We are the church. It's not a building we go to, but it's us as disciples of Jesus. So yeah, but what about adaptations? You mentioned a few already, using things like marriage or purpose and finding felt needs in your own community, and around those felt needs, finding ways to, you mentioned a course. Now, are you using Discovery Bible Studies in that course, or what do you mean when you say a course? I think, again, we have a sort of typical image in our mind when we think of that, but I'm assuming you might be doing those a little differently.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we've discovered is that the typical American person, the invitation to read the Bible and discover what God has to say about life, is available to some and inviting to some, but other people, just like if in anywhere in the world that you and I've been, it's like some people use health, medical trips, they use water, they use food, they use um, all kinds of microfinance, all kinds of things to create the environment out of which you can plant those those groups. And so uh, we oftentimes, sometimes, if someone has a good enough relationship with their neighbors, they can just invite their neighbors to what we call a discovery group. And it's just 7 questions. It's about the Bible, and maybe it's about marriage. 7 questions about marriage. Or, I mean, not questions about marriage, 7 passages or 6 passages about marriage. And so we'll invite them into that. The purpose piece that we're looking at is a little more complicated, in the sense is that we discovered that people just seem to have this lack of purpose. They don't know, they're come up, they got out of college, or got into a work situation. They built up enough equity in that work situation, but it's not meeting their soul felt needs. And so they're wondering about changing directions and that kind of stuff. And so this course called Life Unique is pretty complicated, but it's an access ministry. So it's building this kind of pool of people that might have some spiritual interests, that out of that we start our discovery groups and help them begin to pursue their relationship with God. Um, so it's that kind of thing, that being creative about this. You know, as you and I both know, simplicity is the real key to replication. If we're going to get this thing to multiply, our methodologies have to be simple. Everyone has to be able to play at the level of methodology, and so not everyone can go to school and get a theological degree and all those kinds of things. So we just discovered some things in a North American context. For instance, the concept of oikos. If you go to a training and someone's coming in from overseas and they're teaching about oikos, and we're trying to penetrate these oikoses. We're not trying to extract people from them, but we're trying to put the gospel inside them and let it spread. Um, the,
Can I
the
just pause you there? Can you just tell what some people may be very new? What is an oikos? What does that mean? Just to,
it's the biblical word for household. So it would relate to a social network, a tight social network. Not your Facebook friends. I'm not talking about that kind of network, but maybe your family, your friends. You might have some affinities in some type of hobby you have that you relate to people closely. But it's this very tight social network. Um, we find that there are very few tight social networks in the West. That our former Surgeon General just wrote a book on loneliness, and I think his name is Vivitek Murty, and he's chronicling this idea of loneliness and how it exists. And so we sometimes are surprised that we get a spouse interested in a spiritual journey, and the other spouse, it's not even an oikos, not even a biblical sense that they trust each other about this spiritual journey. And so the frustrating part about it is some of the framework that we learn, from the East, bringing it to the West. We have to rethink ourselves and understanding, how do we find these affinities? Neighbors don't know each other's names. Um, Families don't live close together anymore, and so there's so little personal connection. So, just if I could tell a story here, in the neighborhood I live in, we had a couple who really wanted to catalyze some things, and so we had already experienced fourth generation growth in another neighborhood. So we groups started groups. We got this fourth generation going, and it stopped right there. It just fell apart. And so as we started doing some postmortems, we began to realize is that um, even though we were doing discovery Bible study and that kind of, it still was kind of extractional. These people weren't in a network together. They were lonely neighbors who wanted to meet people, and they had sociological needs and not theological interests. So the second time around, we decided to put the community together. So this couple worked really hard to build community in this neighborhood. So I've told the story a jillion times, so people have heard it on here. I apologize, but they used to set their a stroller on their porch, and when someone else would come by, it's kind of in a gentrified area where young couples are moving back into old houses, and so on the front porch stroller, someone would come by in a stroller. They would let them go by, get throw them in the stroller, go the opposite direction around the block. And so they ran into one another. Oh, hey, you've got kids, we've got kids. And they built huge relationships out of just being kind of relationship stalkers. And now it's a there's a Facebook page. In this COVID period, we've had all kinds of stuff going on. The food trucks coming into our neighborhoods, and there's monthly women's meetings. There's a Sunday night men's game night. There's all kinds of relational connections. Now it's out of that, when those relationships that we have been able to start discovery groups and
Mm.
be able to fish in those ponds because the relationships are there. What happened beforehand is we discovered that in certain situations, many North Americans are so hungry for relationship that they will get involved in a group, even around reading the Bible, but they have no spiritual interest. They just have sociological interest. They just want to talk to people, get to know people. So just those kind of things, exegeting our culture enough to know what's going on here, and why when we see generational growth and it doesn't continue, realizing that, oh, okay, we're, we were misguided, in our own thinking, about these kind of things.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Well, you've again given some really interesting insights. I love the story, and thank you for sharing both a success story and a story where you didn't see what you were hoping for. I think sometimes when we talk about DMMs, we share only the success stories, and it's important to realize that sometimes we're going to try something and it's not going to work. But then you tried again, you learned from it, you evaluated, you drew insights, and then you tried again in a different kind of way and saw greater fruit and success.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just want to mention too, right, a few people are saying they're not hearing you very well.
Okay.
So the way you can speak up just a little bit, that might help them.
Lean in. I'll talk louder.
There we go. But yeah, and just I love how you talked about building affinity and community as one of the first steps. Someone else was asking, what are the first steps? How do we get started doing this? And what I hear you saying, if I'm hearing you right, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is that building community can be one of the first steps. And you talked about being a relationship stalker again, looking for those people you can build relationship, being a catalyst for relationship in your community where you live, and helping people know each other and build genuine relationship with each other in the community. And then out of that, you can start to have these discovery studies. And I also took note when in the book as well that you in the U.S. you're calling them discovery studies, not discovery Bible studies,
Mhm.
not because you're leaving the Bible out, but
Right.
just because that word, in a first invitation could be a little bit of a turnoff.
Yeah.
So to discover about marriage or discover about whatever felt need topic you're doing those studies on. So good.
One
Uh,
one of the things I think with North Americans that is difficult, and this is making something easy that's difficult. We do it. We tend to hear these stories. Like, for instance, I've often chided Jerry Trousdale. I encourage him to write a prequel to Miraculous Movements, because he doesn't uh, go through the 9 years of difficulty before those movements began to start, and we
mm,
don't see the heartache and the shed blood that happened as a result of that. Even in telling the Bush Pori movement story, if you hear David tell it, there's a 6 year period of before any multiplication took place whatsoever. And so I think sometimes we look at these things and they're like magic. They're like these trinkets that we can pull from the East and just plop this methodology down and realize that, man, our hearts have to be prepared. There's a humility that comes in praying and understanding this is not about flesh and blood. This is a spiritual battle that has to take place. We have to change in terms of our methodologies and how we apply things, and there's just a humility that we have to bring to this. And there's work to understand our culture and how it works, because our culture is different and we don't have we're a disconnected culture, and most of the places we're looking at are connected cultures. We're a religious culture, and I think there's probably a study to be had that would look at the inverse proportion of success in disciple movements and the prevalence of religiosity or church and stuff. One of the reasons I love Kenya and spend a fair amount of time there is because they've had a church for 200 years. And so understanding what's happening in Kenya helps me better translate things that are going on in the US.
Sure. Yeah. And just thinking on a global scale and all my experience has been abroad, actually. I've never tried to do this in the US. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on, because you have pioneered this and done it and seen multi-generational growth here. But it's amazing how quickly the church establishes itself. When I think of, say, Nepal, it's a small country and the church is very well established in just 20 years or so. And church traditions are well established. So I think we fight this everywhere where there is an above ground church, and being willing to enter into that. And again, like you said, it's not always easy to go against the flow of tradition, and a lot of prayer, a lot of humility, a lot of soul searching that goes into launching these movements. And I think also when we talk about the model, we talk about rabbit churches and rapid multiplication. And once things are catalyzed and moving, they really can multiply in that type of way. And you hear about, in Indonesia, these movements of 30,000 or 50,000, and these are real. These are valid things that are happening around the world and can happen even here. I really believe that. And yet, they don't always start immediately. As you're building that community, as you're learning, as you're experimenting. I remember hearing someone who's working in Central Asia say, after the 900th attempt, they suddenly saw movement and now it's growing really rapidly. It's that tenacity that says, I believe this is from God. I believe it's biblical. I believe God can do this, but I'm going to fight for it. I'm going to fight for it in prayer, on my knees, in prayer, in tears, and I'm going to be willing to sacrifice and train people to think differently around me. So yeah, we've got a few questions here. Maybe we'll move to one of those if that's okay.
Yeah.
There's a question here. It says, Roy, what do you feel is a reasonable time estimate for identifying a person of peace and starting your first group in a North American setting? Yeah, do you want to go for that one?
Sure. Well, I would say that that's a hard question to answer. I know people who have, in 1 week, started thinking differently about this, discovered the principle, and identified persons of peace. I know people who've gone 3 years and had a difficulty. There's as much science as there is art to this, and understanding what a person of peace looks like, how they respond to you, and those types of things. So I think, what we find, and this is not so much directed at the person of peace idea, but what we find is that it takes about 18 months for people to get their heads and hearts around this new way of thinking. When I first got to know the Miraculous Movements team, the used to be the city team, now they're New Generations, I sat down and I had a chance. I was with them for 2 weeks and interviewed people like Shadaki Johnson and Yunusa Zhao and Aichi and those guys. And so as I interviewed them, I heard them say something that astounded me. And it was the sixth time I went to a training with David Watson, the sixth time, every one of them. And so there's a period, and we like to think of it now in terms of a spiral as we've developed this rubric for training, is that so these 6 habits that exist are like tool sheds or garages or toolboxes that have tools in them. And it takes time to keep moving around in this spiral and so momentum becomes the critical factor as I learn more and more about praying and more about engagement, more about finding persons of peace and discovery and how to lead discovery and those kinds of things. So it just takes time. So 18 months to just get the framework. It takes about 3 years to begin to see success in planting groups that multiply. And the discouraging thing about this, even as I was first in these discussions, I asked Watson one time. I said, "So what was the success ratio of groups in the Bhojpuri area?" He goes, "Well, about 1 out of 10 succeeded." And it was like, "Holy smokes, you're kidding me!" And there's one thing about North America, and one thing about the difficulty of this is that we are allergic to failure.
Mm.
And so, we want, if this is not working, there's a new CD or new DVD series by whatever the hot guy is these days, that I can pop in and we can do that. And that's the biggest thing, or so and so's written a book and he's got lightning in a bottle, and so we can do that. But the fact is that, that what you and I are familiar with is our movements that not only had great spiritual power, but also great human effort that went into, and that dip that everyone has to go through. There's this great excitement, encouragement, and then a dip that we go into, and that's why it's about a team, and it's not about individuals. We really ask people, you need to go sideways as much as you need to go out. In that sense, you need to find a group of people you can link arms with, you can pray together with, and you encourage one another, because you're going to face a lot of failure. And as you face failure, you need, help in that process. So we feel like in that 3 year period, if you're alone by yourself, you may not make it. A lot of people don't make it. There's been a lot of training done in the U.S. And Canada related to DMM. So it's not the fact that there haven't been a lot of people trained, but I don't think there's been a lot of warrior hearts developed.
Mm.
One of the things we see, and I know you see this especially in your work, uh, people who have made a decision to go cross culturally and are in these more difficult situations, they have this warrior spirit about them, and they usually exist in a team, and they're going to go through the dip, and they're going to make it out in that 3 year period.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. And as you know, I have a course, an online course called Getting Started in Disciple Making Movements. And in the very first module, I think it's the second lesson, we talk about casting vision to a potential team and building that team of people. Because like you said, we need community, we need other people to experiment with. Having a discovery Bible study or a discovery study, a 3-part meeting together with others who are on your team and practicing it together so it becomes more familiar. All those things are so critical, I think, around the world. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. And building community can be so key as well. We do have a question. What's a person of peace? There's some people on the call who are pretty new to the idea of DMMs, and maybe we could talk about that for a few minutes.
Sure. Well, it's a concept that comes out of Luke 10, Matthew 10, where Jesus is sending out his followers, and he's encouraging them as they go cross culturally to look for people. So if you offer peace to them and they return peace, stay right there. This idea of you share your own spiritual journey or whatever your worldview is in that sense, however innocuous it might be, but they're open to that. They're interested in that, and they're willing to provide hospitality for you. So that person becomes really the key to reaching a particular social network. And one of the things we've discovered is, you know this well, that person becomes a gateway, and so we tend to focus in on that person, build a discipling relationship with that person, and I become the outsider. I'm not going to take the gospel to these folks that they might relate to, but I'm going to relate to them, and they're going to be the ones who start discovery groups and that kind of stuff. So that person of peace becomes that first follower in many ways, in a process. I don't know, how would you describe that?
Yeah, no, very similarly. I was just thinking through, what does it look like? What does a person of peace look like in Asia, where I've worked, or in Africa, where I've trained a lot of people, and what does it look like here in the U.S.? Well, I think one of the key differences I would see, and tell me if you agree with this, is that in Africa or in Asia, they would invite you into their home and maybe offer you a cup of tea or offer you a meal, and welcome you into their home. Well, in the West, it may not be a home setting, I'm thinking, but they may pick up, say, hey, you invite them to coffee, say, hey, let's have a coffee. And they say, hey, let me buy your coffee, or they're saying, hey, let me, bring along, this friend, or they're introducing people. You see them as a networker who calls others into that coffee conversation that you may not have in a home. I mean, I think Americans are particularly slow to open their homes, while in India, to honor a guest is, it's considered, a guest is like God, is actually part of Hindu ideology. So opening your home to a stranger is much more common in other cultures, or in the Middle East. It's very easy to have access into people's homes through hospitality, which is such a cultural value. But tell me, what does it look like when you meet a person of peace? Yeah, maybe we can just unpack that a little bit further.
Well, I think, in that setting you're talking about where hospitality is really well practiced, the conversations, typically spiritual conversations, are also easy to have. Uh, that, they exist in a much more spiritual world. I think in North America, we exist in a material world. And so spiritual conversations are not as easy to have. And many of us have grown up in a type of Christianity that focuses in on the relationship, with the idea that I'm looking for an opportunity to share my faith, rather than just connect and invite someone into my story, rather than try to persuade them to believe in Jesus or something. So I think in that moment, curiosity becomes the greatest tool for understanding, if a person is spiritually interested. And so,
Mm.
learning, like we teach people to have 5 questions available. Just learn 5 questions that really are the kinds of penetrating questions, not just where do you work and how many kids you have, but it's like, who in your life has influenced you the most? And who are the 3 most significant influences in your life? Getting into someone's life and being curious, all of a sudden there's reciprocity when you enter a relationship at that level, and that
Right.
reciprocity allows you then to be able to share your own spiritual journey in a very natural way. And I think the key to finding persons of peace is learning to be spiritually obvious early in the conversation, without being obnoxious, and so creating those natural moments to be able to share who you are, what's going on in your life. And if it's not something spiritual, then I guess we have to look back at our own life and ask ourselves, do we have this kind of do we have the Christianity virus deep enough to be able to share that?
Yeah, I love that. Being willing to be spiritually obvious early in the conversation,
Mhm.
and developing the skill of asking open questions to people that show genuine interest in who they are. And that often is a bridge that creates the opportunity for you then to share who you are, and being spiritually open about who you are, unashamed of that. And that this is something you're passionate about, and Jesus has changed your life. And I find that in India, I find that in people working with Hindus, Buddhists, and Muslims as well. Often we are not as willing to be open about our faith being the hugest thing in our life, the biggest part of my life, as Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists are, you
Yeah.
know. I think there does, there is a needed boldness, but in the place of authenticity and genuine relationship and openness about sharing about who you are, not being preachy, but just sharing, this is who I am and this is what's happened in my life, and in that kind of a natural type of way. So I love that phrase, spiritually obvious. I'm gonna keep that in my training manual there, and borrow that once in a while.
I,
But
I stole it from Watson. So, uh,
okay.
one of the I think issues that Christians, in North America, we're typically trying to start these disciple making movements in the Christian community, and it breaks out, and that's has happened every place else. But one of the issues, I think, is that we've been convinced that people don't want to have spiritual conversations. And the American Bible Society every year does a survey in which they look at the religious temperature or whatever of Americans. And one of the things they find is about 67% of Americans want to know more about God, Jesus, and the Bible. And so, somehow, in some way, Satan has convinced us that we have a population of people who don't want to know anything about it. And the problem is that they're not afraid of God, they're not afraid of Jesus, they're not afraid of the Bible, they're afraid of us. And it's our methodologies of trying to cram things down their throats that have created a fear, and that causes them to see us as intolerant, homophobic, blah 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 blah. And so when you learn to develop a habit of curiosity, it makes all the difference in the world, because that environment of curiosity is where we were created to connect. And so I just think that there's some basic training, basic human skills training that stand in the way of a lot of people being able to see the gospel move.
Right.
And
Wow.
so have you
Maybe
thought
that should be our next book. We'll do it together on basic human skills training for DMM. Yeah.
about, I have written on my wall here uh, this idea of a curiosity camp. Creating a 3-day experience that teaches people to be curious, um,
Mm.
so that they could understand the dynamic. And I'm telling you, there's an excitement about, getting into someone's story and then them getting into your story. I mean, we were built for that. We were made in the image of God. We were built to connect. And so when we do that, it makes all the difference in the world. And it just provides a perfect platform for talking about our spiritual journeys.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, we're getting to the end of our hour. I want to be sure we have time to mention some of the great resources that you guys are offering and talk about that. But I do have one last question before we go to those. And it's about, it relates to one of your resources. You wrote a book called Hybrid Church,
Mhm.
right? And you've talked about this hybrid model of how to relate with legacy churches, or sometimes we call them traditional churches, and how to integrate these two. And kind of a complex idea, something that we haven't necessarily done in Asia and Africa. But tell me a little bit about that book and about that model, just as we don't have a lot of time, but just briefly.
Well, it was just for us, we looked at what we were doing at Shoal Creek and we realized that we were moderately effective on Sunday morning. We still had, at that point when we were meeting physically on a monthly basis, we had about 40 unique visitors coming through, usually represented a family, at least a single parent or maybe a couple of parents, as whatever. And half of those people were still self-identifying as non-believers. So we looked at that and said, we don't have anything else that's getting us close to 10 or to 20 non-believing families, every month and stuff. So why would we stop doing this? And so it caused us to just think about this idea. And it came from a hybrid car that has two separate power plants in it, gas and electric, and just this idea that they can coexist. And so we've built a model that allow them to coexist in this world. And so they operate in many ways on the same principles. If you remember my early story, the ideas of everyone gets to play and get your fingerprints on the Bible and all those kinds of stuff were already in that come strategy. And so when we added the go strategy to it, they have some similar DNA to them. And you have to be comfortable, though, as I mentioned earlier, in the go strategy, we're not asking people to come back. We're not. It's not a church growth strategy. It's a kingdom growth strategy. So we have no problem with the gospel moving away from us and planting a neighborhood church or a rural situation or whatever it has. We don't care if they come back. We care if they know Jesus, and that's the vital difference in what you have to come to grips with. And unfortunately, for most church staff people, they're not held accountable for the gospel moving away from them. They're held accountable for the gospel moving toward them. So that's the hurdle that we have to get over in implementing a kind of hybrid strategy.
That's wonderful, and so so key as we think about not just disciple making movements. I don't know about you, but for me, I don't really care whether we see disciple making movements. I care whether we see
Mm-hmm.
kingdom come to North America and the rest of the world and see it grow and multiply in people's lives and hearts. And whether we call them DMMs, maybe 10 years from now we'll call them something else. I have no idea. Doesn't matter to me, because strategy is just the catalyst, it's just the tool, but it's the kingdom of God coming in people's lives and that transformation that results that impacts them, their families, their neighbors, the people they work with, the people at the gym, their
Yeah,
affinity groups, and it starts to spread in an organic kind of way. And I know that's what we're both all about. Well, yeah, I want to point people to our different resources that we have available and the websites. And I know we've got some people that can put those links in for you. If you're watching, we do have one last question I'm going to ask Roy to answer here, but you can go to dmmsfrontiermissions.com/DMM resources, and Roy's book is there, my book is there. There's a book I've written as well with Kevin Sutter called Faith to Move Mountains, which is about how to move through these difficult times that require perseverance and just getting into the Word of God again. And what does it say to give us that faith and hope to keep going? So that's a great resource for you as well. And there on my blog as well, there's lots of other resources. Roy, you have a website, New Generations. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? And also mention the learning community.
sure. So, I work with an organization. I work at several different organizations, but the one that sort of operationally on the ground is New Generations North America, and we're building a network of disciple making movement minded people. And so you can go out to newgenerations.us or newgenerations.ca, depending on where you're at, and find out more about that. Or we house our resources at disciplemakingmovements.com, disciplemakingmovements.com. And there's all kinds of resources. If you want to get into a training loop or a coaching loop and that kind of stuff, you can go there and grab a hold of stuff.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I did want to mention too, the course that getting started in disciple making movements enrollment is open right now for that course. And the link is disciples.teachable.com/P/disciple making movements 1. So it's a little bit of a long one. They're going to stick that link in there for people. But if you're interested in more training and would be like to check that out, we'd encourage you to do that as well. One last question, and then we're going to have to wrap up. There's quite a few extra questions here, so maybe we'll have to add some new blogs or chats that answer those, Roy. But we have one from Lorena Wood, and good to see you on the call, Lorena. So glad that you could be with us. And she says, give an example of habit curiosity dialogue if you only have 2 minutes with someone.
Ooh.
Good question.
Yeah, that would be hard in terms of 2 minutes. But I think just in terms of curiosity, for me, it's about having some questions that you learn to craft yourself that feel natural and normal to you. Um, we're always asking you, how you doing? How things going? What's life like in your world? And those kinds of general questions lead to very general answers. Um, but just simply asking. We have in our second question in our discovery process is what's your biggest challenge today? And being able to ask someone, hey, what's your biggest challenge today? And then simply say, would you mind if I just prayed for you right now and just prayed about that challenge? And that could be just a way, people, I've never had anybody refuse to be prayed for. I don't care if it's standing in the middle of a restaurant or where it's at, I've never had anybody refuse to be prayed for. And so that becomes a real opportunity just to identify, hey, I believe that there's a God, and I think we can talk to him, and I want to talk to him about you right now. So I think if I only had 2 minutes, that might be a question I would ask and a response.
Right. Yeah, and that's part of that being spiritually obvious, isn't it? When you bring that up, you're obviously a person who believes in prayer, and you're someone who's willing to talk about that. And yeah, and I love what you said about just finding two questions or one question that works for you. And I find for me, I'm an introvert, Roy. I don't know about you if you're an extrovert or introvert, but I'm an introvert. I don't naturally talk to people who I don't know anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have to take quite a bit of initiative, and I find practice really helps me. If
Mm-hmm.
the first 2 or 3 times I use a new question with someone at the grocery store, or even with someone across the street, it feels awkward because I'm an introvert.
Mm-hmm.
But the more times I ask that question, the more times I use that, my brain gets into those channels and it becomes easier. It
Yeah.
becomes a lot easier and it starts to feel more natural to me. And then it feels more natural to them. So I would just say to people on the call, be patient with yourself. If it feels awkward the first 3 or 4 times, don't quit. Keep initiating those conversations and practicing that. Even practice it with your husband or your kids at home before you go. But practice does help us sort of get those neurons, to go in that direction so that it can feel more natural to us, and then it feels more natural to the other person.
I know families who have a bowl on the table at dinner, and someone has taken the time to write some of these questions out. And so at dinner in the evenings, they regularly, as a family, just answer these questions with one another. So they're creating this culture of curiosity in the family that will bleed over ultimately, into their as they move out through their day.
That's a great idea. I'm going to try that with my husband. So thanks for that little tip. I hope some of you on the call will try that. Make a curiosity questions bowl on your dining room table and start to develop the habit of being someone who is interested in others and ask those questions. Think about community. How can you build community with the people around you? And yeah, be sure to get Roy's book, Spent Matches, Hybrid Church, and jump onto that website. And again, I do want to mention the online course I'm offering and the books that we have as well. So I hope this has been helpful to you guys. Thanks so much for being on the call. Those of you who showed up live, and I know a lot of people will be watching it in the days to come as well. And especially Roy, thank you so very much for being with me today. It's just been a joy to get acquainted with you a little better. I've taken notes today, learned a lot, and look forward to learning more from you in the days to come.
Well,
So
likewise, I appreciate you reaching out and taking the initiative. I've enjoyed, as I've mentioned earlier, your innovation and stuff you're doing. It's just incredible. So keep it up, keep going.
thank you so much. Well, hey, I'd just like to ask you, would you pray over those who are here on the call and just pray a blessing as they endeavor to launch disciple making movements, many of them in North America, that God would release faith and hope to them today.
Oh,
Love
I'd
that.
love to. Father, you have called us into partnership with yourself. Um, we don't feel qualified. We don't feel that we have the right skills and abilities, but we feel that tug of your spirit and our spirit to join the cause. So I thank you for these men and women who are listening, and I just ask that you would envision them with the kind of spirit that you had when you gathered your followers on that mountain after you had been resurrected, and you gave them this last command to go and make disciples, to do it of everyone, and to teach them obedience, teach them to obey all that you've commanded, to be identified with you in baptism. Father, I know that early in your ministry you foreshadowed that when you taught us to pray, when you taught us to pray that may it be on earth as it is in heaven. You want to bring your kingdom to this earth. So, Father, I pray that as a result of this hour we spent together, that the places that these people live will be more like heaven and less like hell. I trust that you would make us kingdom agents in our world. Teach us methodologies, Father, that to plant the gospel in such a way that it moves away from us. It's not dependent on us being present. Um, Father, some of us need to have our hearts broken. Some of us need to have our tongues uh, wrapped up, and some of us need to just sit still and pray. Some of us need to get going. Some of us need to have more courage and boldness. So there's so many things that need to happen as a result of us being engaged in Great Commission work. So I just pray that you would give us humble, simple hearts, just a willingness to move in the direction that you encourage us to move in. Thanks for this opportunity, Father. I thank you for the history that exists here between us and the footprint of the kingdom touch that you have given. Um, Father, I just pray a blessing on this ministry, and I just ask that this course that's still open, that people would see the opportunity and take advantage of that opportunity. Father, I pray that people would get involved in coaching networks and coaching loops and all kinds of stuff, and just see the need to be in a team. Father, thank you again for the privilege of being your ambassador, and just being able to help people reconnect with a Father in heaven who so desperately wants them to be a part of his family. Help us be more effective at that, Father. Thanks for this time. Thank you for the beauty of this technology that you've given us to be able to spread this so far and so wide to so many. Blows our minds, Father, and we just appreciate you and what you've done in our lives. So we come and pray these things, Father, in the name of our Savior Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thanks again. And I'm glad you prayed about the community. Did want to just plug that one more time. Roy has an awesome learning community available that you can check out on the New Generations website or on his roymoran.com. And either through the course or through some other way, find a team, find people to connect with, and that's going to help you move forward. And keep connecting with us. We're here as well. And write to us or stay connected with us. We'd be happy to help in any way we can. But God bless you guys. And thanks again, Roy. And we'll see you sometime in Kansas City or some other part of the world.
Awesome. Don't hesitate. Let's have barbecue together.
Oh, that'd be awesome. Okay. God bless. Bye-bye.
See you guys. Thanks.